From 1946 until 1951, the Swedish government, with funding from the sugar and chocolate manufacturers, carried out one of the most disturbing experiments into the effects of sugar on a person's teeth. Human subjects were fed high-sugar diets, including a specially created toffee designed to stick to teeth. These human subjects were found at the Vipeholm Hospital, which housed people with various learning or mental disabilities who were unable to consent to the 6-year-long experiment. By the end, those who were forced to eat the high-sugar diets were left with dozens of cavities each, without any follow-up treatment. In today's video, we will cover just why such experiments took place, what the patients were forced to endure, and the consequences. It is perhaps helpful to start with the situation in Sweden at the turn of the 20th century. Very little was known about the causes of dental diseases such as cavities, and in Sweden, rates of such diseases were astoundingly high. 80% of infants aged 3 had cavities, whilst the Swedish military reported 99% of its conscripts having some form of dental issues. Dentists were few and far between, and usually prohibitively expensive for the average person. During sugar rationing of the First and Second World Wars, decay rates dropped. It was also noted that children in orphanages without access to high-sugar diets did not suffer the same rates of dental diseases. It was suspected that sugar and carbohydrates were to blame, but there was little in the way of scientific evidence. The impetus to carry out research came as part of wider social reforms being put in place by the Swedish Social Democratic government. The cost to implement a nationwide dental service was projected to be expensive, and so it was decided that prevention of dental decay was better than the cure. In 1939, the National Board of Health posed 2 questions. 1. What was the cause of tooth decay? And 2. How could it be prevented? A sufficiently large sample of human test subjects would be required to find the answers. Yet, there was a problem. These experiments would be high risk for those involved, putting their dental health at risk. Other factors would need to be monitored, and the test subjects requiring careful observation. The solution to these problems would be found in the patients of the Vipeholm Hospital. The Vipeholm Hospital was described as an institute for the mentally deficient. The patients were often sent there by their families, unable or unwilling to care for them, often pressured by the authorities that such hospitals were the best place. Those with psychiatric disabilities were at the time diagnosed with imbecility, which covered a wide range of conditions and needs, such as Down syndrome, autism, and all manner of learning difficulties. Very often, such people were labelled as uneducable. At the time, the hospital housed around 1,000 people. Around 1/3 were bedbound or strapped to their beds at all times. Around 50% had difficulties in communication. Most of the patients would spend the rest of their lives in the hospital, often without any contact from their families. It was from this population of forgotten, disregarded, and dehumanized people that the test subjects were selected. The man in charge of the hospital, Dr. Hugo Frodeberg, welcomed the scientists to experiment on his patients with open arms. It is fair to say that Frodeberg had a dim view of those under his care. He ranked his patients on a scale of 0 to 6 for intelligence, often referring to the patients as if they were animals. He was quoted as saying at the time that the material for study, that is the patients, were unique as the lowest of them felt no pain, even if one were to hold a lit match to their lips. Of the 1,000 patients, 633 were selected due to their perceived acceptance, though for the publishing of the results, the data of 436 patients were used. Around 2/3 of the subjects were male, with an average age of around 30. There were, however, a number of children enrolled in the study, as young as 6 years old. The patients did not consent to the experiment in any way. Those selected had to show no signs of tuberculosis and needed at least 10 teeth in various degrees of health. The experiment began in 1946 with the unwilling participants given for the first year a balanced diet along with vitamin supplements. At this stage, a number of the hospital staff took part. It was hoped that such a diet would reverse the effects of the existing decay. Although it did not reverse the effects, there was little in the way of further damage to the patient's teeth. For the often previously poorly fed patients, they left the first year healthier than they had been in a long time, although this increase in health would soon be offset. For the next 2 years, the unwilling participants were split into various groups. One group would continue to eat a normal diet, acting as the control. Others would be given all manner of high-sugar food. For example, one group was given a sucrose solution with each meal. Another was made to eat chocolate every day, and another group was forced to eat caramels each day. 2 of the groups were given toffees, one given 8 regular toffees each day, but the other was given something far more disturbing. The manufacturers involved were told to produce the worst toffee imaginable. The goal was to create a toffee that would be incredibly difficult to dislodge from one's teeth, that would be larger than regular toffees and would require more chewing. These Vipeholm toffees were given to the patients, who were made to eat as many as 24 of these a day. The goal was to have the participants eating these toffees at all times of the waking day for the duration of the first 2 years of the study. After the first 2 years of the study, portion sizes were altered for the groups, either less of the sucrose solution or introducing new sugary foods to the diets of the test subjects. It is perhaps not surprising that for the 24 toffee group, there was no longer a need to test the effects. The toffees were withdrawn and no more sugar was added to their diets of the patients. After the first 2 years, cavities, decay, and instances of dental disease rose to an average of 21 per individual. In short, the patients of this group, some 50 people, had their teeth utterly ruined. In 1947, whilst the experiments were still running, the Nuremberg Codes were passed. These were ethical principles enshrined into international law following the trials of the Nazi doctors who conducted horrendous experiments on unwilling prisoners, notably Jews, Slavs, and Roma. The key requirement now for any human experiments was voluntary, informed consent. This one was the first of 10 points that formed the code, including that such experiments needed to be for the good of humankind, that all physical and emotional harm be minimalized as much as possible, and that the experiments ought to be stopped if there is a risk of injury or death to the subjects. And yet, there was no alteration to the Vipeholm experiments in light of the new standards of ethical and humane human research. The experiment continued, with diets given to the participants resembling the average Swedish family diet. By the end of the experiment, nothing was done to remedy the damage done to the patient's teeth. It was dismissed that the patients refused such treatment. As stated previously, the study was in part funded by the Swedish Chocolate, Confectionery and Biscuit Manufacturers Association. Some £60,000 of confectionery was provided during the study, including the infamous toffee designed to stick to the person's teeth. As you might imagine, the patients would often grow tired of the same chocolates, and so, new flavours were developed and provided to the unwilling subjects. Whilst it may seem odd that these companies would sponsor such an event that might ruin their business, they gained access to the data to better understand which candies caused the most damage, and to better profit from more sustainable recipes. Once the data was compiled and it was clear that sugar and carbohydrates were the cause of dental disease, the manufacturers pushed back the publication of the results for a number of years. It was not until 1953 that the paper was published. It is important to note that not everyone in the Swedish Parliament approved of the study. In 1957, the Swedish government initiated a public health policy that is still popular to this day. Lördagsgodis, that is, Saturday sweets, was to encourage the eating of sweets on a Saturday as opposed to every day of the week. To this day, the Nordic countries remain top of the leaderboard in dental hygiene, in part due to the culture around sweets, but also due to the access of quality healthcare. Whilst today we have a better idea about the dangers of sugar, it is still an ongoing issue. From the proliferation of high sugar syrups in all manner of food and drink to the lack of access to affordable healthcare, there is still much to be done. Whilst the research was no doubt useful in showing a correlation between sugar and dental disease, it ought to have been carried out in a humane, consensual and dignified manner, with appropriate aftercare provided. The failure to treat these patients with even an ounce of humanity is a truly regrettable affair, and one that has not yet been properly addressed. To then be denied proper dental treatment following the damage imposed on them is beyond unimaginable. Whilst the idea of being given sweets every day for 4 years may not sound like an imposition, especially when compared to the more grotesque experiments conducted during the Second World War, the slow rotting away of the unwilling subject's teeth was insidious and callous, especially because the researchers sought out people who were vulnerable. And yet, there has been no official apology by the Swedish government, nor from the sugar and candy manufacturers who benefited from the research. The victims of the Vipeholm experiment were forgotten, both in life and now some 80 years later. There are links in the description to some papers about the experiments for those who wish to read further and to better understand what these people went through.